The reading of the will took place on the third morning after the late Duke of Ashfield's funeral, in a drawing room still draped in the black crepe of mourning, and Dorothea Vane stood at the service doorway because no one had thought to close it against her. She was not supposed to be there. The room held only those who mattered. The solicitor, a mild man named Fawcett, who had replaced the late Duke's original counsel 6 weeks before. The death with very little explanation. Mr. Phineas Vere, first cousin, who occupied the chair nearest the fire with the settled ease of a man who already knew the answer. Lady Mira Vere beside him, her gloves a cold ivory against her black sleeve. And at the far end of the room, standing rather than seated, the new Duke of Ashfield himself. Dorothea had seen him only once before this morning, a profile against the west window when he arrived the day of the death. She had carried a tray, and he had not looked at her. He stood now with his hands clasped behind him and his attention fixed on some middle point above the solicitor's head, as if the reading were a formality he was subjecting himself to with measured patience. He was tall, his coat was dark, and his cravat was precisely tied, and his face held nothing she could name. The journal was in her apron pocket. Its spine had worn a small impression there over 2 months, a groove she could find with her thumb in the dark. The late Duke had pressed it into her hands 10 days before he died, his own grip still surprising in its force, and said to her, "Keep this until someone asks for it who has the standing to use it." She had not known what he meant. She was beginning to understand. Mr. Fawcett read in a thin, carrying voice. The estate, the title, the properties in 3 counties went to Gideon Hartwell, Duke of Ashfield, as legitimate heir. No surprise? No stir. Then Fawcett paused, turned a page, and said, "With the codicil dated the 14th of October, by which codicil the personal fortune, the London house, and the Ashfield Park estate itself were directed to Mr. Vere, first cousin, in recognition of his constant and faithful attendance upon the late Duke in his final year." His expression did not change. That was what told Dorothea everything. A man who has just heard an unexpected fortune fall to him does not sit still. Phineas sat exactly as still as he had before the reading began. She pressed her thumb to the journal's spine. Her hand was steady, which surprised her. The new Duke had not moved. Then he turned his head, very slightly, toward the service doorway, and for one moment his eyes found her face in the gap between the door and the frame. He did not look away immediately. That was the thing she would remember. He looked at her with the attention of a man cataloging a fact, and then he returned his gaze to Fawcett, and said nothing. Outside in the corridor, her breath came back to her. She smoothed her apron with both hands, feeling the hard edge of the journal through the cloth, and told herself that what she had seen meant nothing. Servants misread rooms. They stood in doorways and caught the edges of things, and believed those edges to be the whole. The new Duke had looked at a doorway. He had seen a maid. There was nothing further in it than that. She believed this for approximately 6 days. Dorothea Vane had come to Ashfield Park at 22, 2 years after her father's death. Her father had been steward here for 19 years, a careful and trusted man who had read to her from Addison and Cowper and kept a modest but real library in the cottage, and whose death of a fever in the wet autumn had left her with his books, his reputation, and no practical means of sustaining either. The late Duke had offered her a position out of something she had always understood to be respect for her father's service rather than sympathy for her own situation, and she had accepted it without self-pity or ceremony. She was a housemaid of the upper kind, trusted with correspondence trays and the late Duke's evening reading aloud when his eyes grew tired. She was not family. She was not precisely a servant of the ordinary kind. She existed in the space between. which in a house like Ashfield meant she belonged to neither world with any security. The late Duke had liked her steady voice and her refusal to arrange the world as simpler than it was. In his last weeks, when Phineas had begun appearing with increasing frequency, attending dinners and lingering in the study, Dorothea had noticed the old man's discomfort and noted it in herself the way she noted all things, without speaking of it, because what a housemaid noted was not evidence. The journal was different. He had called her to his room on the 8th of November, a cold, clear evening with frost already on the inner glass, and he had placed the small book in her hands and told her its history in short sentences, resting between each one. It was a private record, he said. Dates and conversations. He had kept it against the possibility that his cousin would attempt something he had begun to suspect. He had trusted it to her because she would not be searched, and because servants, he said, with a slight dry smile, were the witnesses England forgot to bribe. He had died 9 days later. The new Duke's first act of any substance, so far as Dorothea observed, was to summon the household on the 4th day and ask in a level voice that admitted no interpretation whether anyone had information pertaining to the late Duke's state of mind and affairs in the final months. He stood in the hall and looked at each face in the row of servants, and his expression was not unkind and not warm. He was simply exact. He wanted information. He would take it from whatever source it arrived in. Dorothea took one step forward. She was the third from the end. Phineas was standing at the far side of the hall near the window, and she saw his eyes move to her the moment she shifted her weight. He said nothing then. He waited until the new Duke had dismissed the household, and then he appeared beside her in the corridor, as if by coincidence. His footstep unhurried, his expression the expression of a man who has all the time in the world because he has already won. He said, in a voice pitched below the footman's hearing, that she would do well to remember her station before she began imagining herself useful to her betters. He said this to the side of her face rather than her eyes, as if she were a piece of furniture he was taking care not to damage unnecessarily. He said it the way a man speaks to something small that he has found in the wrong room. His tone was mild. That was the coldest part of it. The entitled cruelty of a person who does not need volume because he has already decided the outcome. She did not reply. She went about her duties, and she kept the journal in her pocket, and she told herself the new Duke had seen her take that step, even if nothing had come of it yet. She did not reply. She went about her duties, and she kept the journal in her pocket, and she told herself the new Duke had seen her take that step, even if nothing had come of it yet. He had. She did not know this. She would learn it. The household had opinions about Dorothea, as households do about members who occupy uncertain stations. She was liked by Mrs. Holt and tolerated by the cook and regarded with a certain cautious wariness by the 2 parlor maids, who understood by instinct that she was different from them without being able to name the difference. Lady Mira Vere, who had installed herself at Ashfield Park with the quiet confidence of a woman who expects the keys to arrive shortly, had formed her own opinion within 48 hours of her arrival. Dorothea heard it from the far side of a door she had not known was insufficiently thick. The maid who imagines herself useful, Lady Mira said to her husband, her voice carrying the particular clarity of a woman not accustomed to modulating for servants. Her presence at the reading this morning was an impertinence. She is to have no access to Hartwell. Dorothea stood in the corridor with her tray and noted this, and moved on. She found the new Duke 2 days after the witnessing scene, in the late Duke's library, standing at the desk with a letter open in his hands and his back to the door. She had come to return a correspondence tray. She set it down and turned to leave. He said, without looking up, that the late Duke had employed a different solicitor before October. It was not a question. She stopped. She said, "Yes, Mr. Alford, of Lincoln's Inn. He served the estate for 30 years. Why was he replaced?" She kept her hand still at her sides and said she did not know the precise reason. She had been present when Mr. Vere suggested to the late Duke that Mr. Fawcett was better suited to the complexities of the estate. The late Duke had not appeared convinced, and yet he had been unwell, and the pressure had continued. The new Duke turned from the desk and looked at her with the same quality of attention he had shown in the drawing-room doorway. She felt it as a physical thing, not uncomfortable, simply complete. He was taking her seriously, which was different from being kind to her. She was not sure she had been taken seriously in 2 years. He said, "You may go, Miss Vane." She went. She was halfway down the corridor before she realized she had not told him her name. He had known it already. If the week that followed taught Dorothea anything, it was that a man could pay attention in a way that remained entirely deniable. The new Duke did not seek her out. He did not contrive occasions of proximity. He was too precise for that, and too reserved, and she suspected he was too honest to engineer what could not be openly acknowledged. Nevertheless, he was present in the East Passage on the morning she carried the library correspondence, a journey she made every day at the same hour, and he acknowledged her with a nod that was not the nod he gave to footmen. He asked her once, in the garden where she had gone to collect herbs for Mrs. Holt's restorative, whether she found the hours long. She said she found them full. He said, very quietly, that he had no doubt of it. And then his attention moved to the kitchen garden wall, and he did not speak again. And she did not either. And they stood in a rather precise silence that was not at all empty. She was aware of him the way she had learned to be aware of the fire in a cold room, a source she did not approach too closely because the warmth itself was a kind of danger. She told herself this was not what it appeared to be. A duke did not notice a housemaid. A duke noticed a problem in his household and its possible solution. She was possibly useful to him. Nothing more. Her hand said otherwise. There was the morning he came too close behind her in the narrow corridor beside the pantry, close enough that she could feel the displaced air when he stopped, and her pulse became audible in her own throat before she had named why. There was the afternoon in the library when he reached past her to retrieve a volume from the lower shelf, and his hand brushed the back of hers on the shelf edge, a contact that lasted less than a second, and she felt it for the remainder of the day. He did not appear to notice. She noticed everything. There was the evening he asked her to read correspondence aloud while he drafted a reply, a task she had performed for the late Duke, and which felt, in Hartwell's company, entirely different. She was conscious of every word she read as a thing he was hearing, her voice in the quiet room between them. He sat with his back partly turned and wrote without looking up, and once, when she paused over an unusual word, he supplied it without hesitation. Just the word, level, his pen still moving. She read on. The fire was low, and the candles were warm, and the room had a quality she had no vocabulary for, being too careful to call it anything resembling what it was. When she finished the last letter and set it down and said she believed that was all, he looked at her across the distance of the desk. He did not speak immediately. The silence lasted 2 counts, perhaps 3, and then he thanked her and returned to his writing, and she left the room with a deliberate steadiness that she was aware he could see. She told herself again that she was useful to him. She told herself this with diminishing conviction. If this is the kind of story that moves you, stay a little longer. The best part is still coming. The nature of Gideon Hartwell became clearer to her on the 11th day, when Mrs. Holt's sister came to the house with a winter cold that had settled badly into her lungs. Mrs. Holt could not leave her duties. Dorothea went instead that evening to the small room the housekeeper kept for her sister's visits, and she read aloud by the candle for 2 hours, from a volume of sermons the old woman found comforting. It was a cold room, and the book was not interesting, and Dorothea's voice was the only warm thing in it. She did not mind. The old woman slept before the end of the 2nd hour, and Dorothea closed the book and sat with her until she was sure the sleep was settled. And then she rose quietly. The Duke of Ashfield was standing in the doorway. He had come for another reason. She would learn later. Mrs. Holt had sent word to him that the sister had arrived, a matter of housekeeping notice. He had glanced into the room to confirm the situation required nothing from him. What he had found instead was Dorothea, and he had not moved. She did not see him until she was nearly at the door. She stopped at the same moment he straightened from the frame. Neither spoke. He was a person of few voluntary expressions. But in the low light of that doorway, something crossed his face that she could not quite name. It was not surprise. It was more like the expression of a man who had suspected something and confirmed it. He said, "Go and take a meal." "It is well past 9 o'clock. She said, "Yes, Your Grace. He stepped aside to allow her through, and as she passed him, she was close enough to catch the faint scent of wool and cold air, the smell of a man who had been outside recently, and her hand went involuntarily to the doorframe as if she needed the steadying. He saw that. She felt him see it. She did not look back. The wound at his center took longer to surface, and when it did, it came sideways, as wounds do. He had been married. Everyone in the household knew this, in the way servants know things, without having been told directly, through the particular hush that fell when certain rooms were mentioned. The portrait in the south gallery had been turned. Mrs. Holt had told Dorothea, in her careful way, that the late Duchess had died in a riding accident 4 years past, and that the Duke did not speak of it, and was not to be drawn on it. Dorothea had noted this, and kept it where she kept all things of this nature, at a careful remove. She learned the rest of it not from anyone but from himself, and not because he intended to tell her. It was an afternoon in the library when he was reading a letter that had been among the late Duke's private correspondence, a collection he was working through systematically. He did not know she was still in the room. She had been replacing books on the upper shelves and had come down the ladder quietly. He was sitting at the desk with the letter, and his hand was pressed flat on the surface beside it, and he was very still in a way she recognized from doorways and corridors, except that this stillness was different. This one had something breaking in it. She stepped too firmly on the last rung. He looked up. The expression was gone before she could have described it, locked behind the composure he carried everywhere. In the gap between seeing it and losing it, she saw a man in genuine pain, private and long-held, and entirely without self-pity. It was the pain of a person who has accused himself and accepted the verdict, and goes on living inside the sentence. She said nothing. She set her armful of books on the side table and turned to leave. He said, "Not particularly to her. She asked me twice for the gray gelding. I refused her both times. The third time I said yes." Dorothea stood still. He said, "She fell within the hour." He paused. "I tell myself the horse was sound." She turned then and looked at him directly. He was looking at the letter, not at her. She said, very quietly, "And was he?" He said, "Yes," she said. "Then you did not cause it." His jaw shifted. He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, low and level, "You're very certain of things, Miss Vane." She said, "You gave her what she asked for. That was not a failure." He looked at her then. The look was not comfortable, and it was not easy, and it lasted long enough that she felt the whole weight of what he was not saying, which was considerable. Then he returned his eyes to the letter and told her again that she might go. She went. In the corridor, she pressed one hand over the journal in her pocket, feeling the leather warm from her body, and stood there for a full minute before she could manage to move. He carried a small oval miniature in his breast pocket. She had seen him touch it twice without thinking. She did not ask. She did not need to. What she did not know then was that before the end of the week, Phineas Vere would force her hand. The assembly in the drawing room took place on the 14th day of the new Duke's residence, and Phineas had arranged it with the particular elegance of a man who knows exactly what cards he holds. He had invited Mr. Fawcett, 2 witnesses from the county, his wife, and a retired magistrate of his acquaintance, and he had notified the Duke of Ashfield that a matter of estate law required formal clarification. The new Duke attended because the new Duke attended everything with the same unhurried precision. Phineas produced the codicil. He laid it on the table with the care of a man presenting evidence rather than a grievance, and he said that the matter of the personal fortune and the Ashfield estate itself was, in his respectful view, settled. The codicil had been witnessed. The witnesses were named. He looked at the room with the expression of a man performing generosity. The new Duke looked at the document for some time. Then he said he wished to hear from those present in the household during the late Duke's final weeks. Phineas said there was no need. The document was clear. Dorothea was standing near the far wall. She was not supposed to be there. She had come with a correspondence tray and had not been dismissed, and had not dismissed herself. She had watched Phineas produce the document, had watched the careful way he laid it down, and something in that careful way had made her understand, with a clarity that arrived all at once, rather than gradually, that the time for waiting was finished. The journal pressed against her palm through the apron cloth. She took one step forward. Phineas looked at her. He said, in a voice designed to carry to every corner, "Miss Vane has a lively imagination, and a servant's instinct for positioning herself where she does not belong. She is," he said, "the maid who imagines herself useful. Her word in a matter of this gravity is not evidence. It is noise." The room was quiet. Lady Mira's fan moved once. The new Duke looked at Dorothea across the room. She could not read his face. She could read nothing in it except that he was present, entirely, in the way of a person who is deciding something. Then he said, "We will adjourn this proceeding until the morning." He folded the document and placed it in his coat pocket, a gesture of authority so calm and complete that Phineas could not find the word to object before the Duke had left the room. Dorothea stood in the middle of the evening with her hands at her sides and thought, "He has accepted the codicil's authority. He will comply because the document is legal, and he is a man of procedure, and she is a housemaid with a journal and a dead man's instructions." That night, Mrs. Holt found her in the kitchen passage and said, with the careful measured face of a person keeping her own feelings behind her teeth, that she had heard from Edmund that the word going round the servants' hall was that Miss Vane had overstepped, that Miss Vane had always imagined herself above her station, that there were those who said she was the maid who imagined herself useful, and would not be so for much longer. Edmund had not looked at her when he said it. He had the decency to look at the floor. Dorothea said, "I see." She went to her room. She took the journal from her apron pocket and held it in both hands and thought about the late Duke's grip, the cold, clear evening, the frost on the glass. He had pressed it into her hands with a force that surprised her given his condition, as if he had been saving the force for this specific purpose. She thought about what it meant to keep something this long, through 2 months of carrying and 2 months of watching, and the whole machinery of his careful patience, and still not to be believed when the moment came to speak. She thought about the new Duke's face in that drawing room, the quality of his attention when he looked at her, the specific gravity of a man deciding something in real time rather than performing a decision already made. She told herself the face was not enough. The face of a man weighing a matter was not the same as a man who had decided in her favor. She had learned, very precisely, not to read more into an expression than the expression contained. She set the journal on her small table and did not sleep. In the morning, she went to Mrs. Holt with the journal and asked her to keep it safe. She said she did not think she would be at Ashfield much longer. She said the late Duke had trusted her with something he could not have known would be so difficult to deliver. She said she was sorry she had not found a way to do it properly. Mrs. Holt looked at the journal for a long time. Then she said, "Give it to me then. And also know that he sent for Alford." Dorothea did not move. Mrs. Holt said, "Hartwell, he sent for Mr. Alford 3 days ago. The senior solicitor. He arrived last evening. He is in the East Study now." Dorothea stood in the housekeeper's room with the journal still in her own hands, and understood that she had, in her conviction that her word would not be enough, nearly taken herself out of the story entirely. The summons came an hour later. Edmund brought it, looking at her directly this time. Miss Vane was required in the drawing room. The drawing room held the new Duke, standing at the cold hearth. Mr. Alford, whom she had not seen in nearly 3 months, seated beside the desk with papers before him. Mrs. Holt near the window, and Phineas standing near the door, his composure intact but strained at something beneath it, the way good cloth strains at a hidden seam. Lady Mira was not seated. She stood behind her husband with her fan in both hands. Phineas began speaking before Dorothea had crossed the threshold. He said the situation was simple and had been made unnecessarily complicated by sentiment. He said that the document was legal, the witnesses were named, and any contrary evidence would require a standard of proof that a housemaid's account could not conceivably meet. He looked at her. He said she was a girl with a vivid sense of her own importance and no standing in which to ground it. He said, with the particular gentleness of a man enjoying himself, that she was, in the end, the maid who imagined herself useful. The room was still. The Duke of Ashfield said, "Miss Vane's word is the only word I will accept. 12 words. Level, final, beyond amendment." Phineas turned to look at him. His composure held for a moment longer than was comfortable to watch, and then the seam gave. Dorothea held the journal in both hands and said, steadily, that on the 14th of October, the late Duke had written in his private record that Mr. Vere had arrived that morning in the company of a man he did not recognize, and that the visit had been short, and the man had brought papers. She said the late Duke had written that the papers were not brought for his signature, that he had refused to receive them, and that he had written his name and underlined it, and then written beside it the word forgery. Mr. Alford, without being asked, rose from his chair and held out his hand. She placed the journal in it. He opened it to the marked page and read it in silence, and then looked up at the new Duke and said, "This is Lord Whitmore's hand. I have 40 letters in his hand from the past decade. It is without question." Phineas said, "She could have written it. She is educated. Everyone knows she is educated beyond her station." Mr. Alford said, "It is dated October the 14th. The ink on the codicil, by my own examination this morning, is less than 6 months old. The codicil was signed, purportedly, on October the 14th. The late Duke's entry proves he was not visited and did not sign anything on that date. He describes a refusal." Phineas was quiet for a very long time. Lady Mira's fan had gone still. The retired magistrate who had been standing near the bookshelves a man Dorothea had not focused on until this moment, said to Phineas, in a voice of complete calm, that he hoped the man was prepared to explain this matter to the circuit court at his convenience. Lady Mira said, in a voice that had lost its shape, "Phineas." She said nothing after that. Phineas looked at his wife. Then he looked at the journal in Mr. Alford's hands. Then he looked at Dorothea, with the expression of a man calculating what is recoverable. And something in what he found there told him the answer. Because his shoulders, very slightly, went down. He left the room without speaking. Lady Mira followed. The magistrate followed them both. Dorothea stood in the middle of the drawing room and found, to her own mild surprise, that her hands were no longer shaking. She was not sure when they had stopped. The new Duke stood at the cold hearth and looked at her. Mrs. Holt was looking at the window. Mr. Alford was closing the journal with great care, unhurried, with the hands of a man who had handled documents of consequence for 30 years, and understood that some of them mattered in ways the law could not fully account for. Hartwell said, "I will see that Mr. Alford returns this to you when the legal proceedings are concluded." She said, "It was always meant for the estate, Your Grace." The late Duke wanted it to come to whoever was the right person to use it. She had been keeping it a long time, and she was glad to let it go. She paused. "I am glad it found its way." He held her gaze for a moment longer than courtesy required. In that moment she saw something in him shift by the smallest degree, the way a door shifts when the latch is no longer held. Then he said he would need her to give a formal account to Mr. Alford today. She said she was at his disposal. He nodded, and she turned to the desk, and they got on with the necessary business of setting things right. She did not see him again until evening. The fire in the south gallery had been lit for the first time since she could remember. The great hearth that ran beneath the row of family portraits. She had come there because the main house was full of a quiet industry she found suddenly exhausting. Mr. Alford and his correspondence, the footman carrying messages, Mrs. Holt settling the household back into its proper shape. She had needed somewhere with no one in it. The gallery was nearly dark. One lamp burned at the far end. The fire gave a warm, uneven light that reached the lower frames but not the upper ones, and the portrait that was not hanging, the gap in the row where a canvas had been removed and faced to the wall, was dark. She heard him before she saw him. Not footsteps, but the quality of the air that changes when a room receives a second person. He came to stand near the fire at a distance that was not the distance of a duke and a servant. It was closer than that. She was aware of his presence in the way she had been aware of it in narrow corridors and library doorways, a warmth that had its own specific gravity. She was aware, too, of the quality of his stillness here, which was different from his stillness in the formal rooms, more like something that had been set down and permitted to rest. The particular composure of a man who had done what he came to do and was now standing in the firelight without performance. She did not look at him directly. She looked at the fire. She was very conscious of the exact distance between them, the inches of warm air, the sound of his breathing beneath the fire's sound. He said, without preamble, "You could have told me on the first day." She said, "I tried. You saw me step forward, and then you looked away." He was quiet. He said, "I looked away, because Vere was watching." She turned to look at him then. He was looking at the fire. His profile in the firelight was more open than she had ever seen it, the careful composure still present, but at a different setting, as if he had turned something down. She said, "I did not know that." He said, "No." He reached into his breast pocket, not for the miniature, though that was there. He stopped short of it, His hand came to rest open at his side. She looked at it without meaning to. The open hand, and understood that this, too, was deliberate. That he was not a man whose hands did things by accident. Then he turned to look at her directly, and she found that she could bear it. The looking, now. She could bear the whole weight of being seen by him, which was something she had not been able to say of anyone for a long time. He said, "Miss Vane?" He stopped. He said, "Dorothea." It was the first time, and they both knew it, and neither pretended otherwise. He said, "I will not ask you to stay in this house as a servant." She held very still. She said, "What would you ask me to stay as?" The fire moved behind him. The gap in the portrait row was dark. He reached out slowly, and his fingers found hers at her side, not taking her hand, but resting his against the back of it. A contact so careful and so deliberate. It was the opposite of accident. He said, "There are forms to observe. There is time required." He said, his voice low, "I would like you to know what direction I intend, so that you may say plainly whether the direction is agreeable to you." She turned her hand under his, very slightly, until her palm met his palm. She said, "It is agreeable." He let out a breath. She felt it in the air between them. His thumb moved once across her knuckles, a slow, deliberate movement, and then he stilled himself, because he was a man who did not confuse permission with haste, and she loved that about him without yet having the occasion to say so. They stood at the fire for a time without speaking. The portrait gap was dark above them. She thought of Eleanor, whose horse had been sound, whose accident had not been his fault, who had perhaps left him the long discipline of holding things carefully rather than losing them by relenting too late or too early. She thought he might, in time, understand that the restraint she had always lived inside was not punishment, but practice. That it had made her someone capable of keeping a thing until the right person came for it. She thought these things and did not say them. Because there would be time, and because the fire was warm, and because his hand was still in hers. In the weeks that followed, Phineas was required to give account of himself to the circuit court, and Mr. Fawcett was found to have witnessed the codicil's preparation and could not satisfactorily explain the evening of the 14th of October. The forged document was voided. The estate was placed in proper order under Mr. Alford's resumed counsel. The title and the fortune and Ashfield Park itself remained with the Duke of Ashfield, as they had always been intended to remain. Lady Mira Vere removed to her family's house in Shropshire before the month was out. She sent no note. The portrait in the south gallery was not returned to the wall, but neither was it removed from the house. It remained where it was, faced inward, tended. Gideon did not explain this, and Dorothea did not ask. Some griefs are not resolved but simply made room for, and the people who understand this are the ones who survive them. By the new year, the household understood something had changed, because households always understand these things before they are announced, through the quality of the silences and the particular way a man who has no social reason to be in a given corridor appears in it nevertheless. Mrs. Holt said nothing to anyone, but permitted herself, in private, a satisfaction she had been owed since November. In January, on a morning when the frost lay thick on the east lawn, and the bare oak at the library window wore a lacing of ice along each branch, the fire in the library had been built up high against the cold. The smell of the room was beeswax and old paper and wood smoke. The smell of every winter morning she had worked here since her first day, and she had not until this morning thought of it as anything other than the smell of a room she was permitted to occupy. It occurred to her, filing a letter, that she thought of it now as home. Gideon came to find her there. He sat across from her at the small table and watched her work for a time, and then said, in his level way, that he had spoken with a clergyman of his acquaintance. She looked up. He said, "There are forms. There is time required." He said, "The time is very nearly finished." She set down the letter she was holding and looked at him across the table and thought about the late Duke pressing the journal into her hands in a cold room in November, saying, "Until someone asks for it who has the standing to use it." She had not understood then that he might have meant more than the journal, that he might have been giving her also the 2 years she would need to become the person the house required. That patience had never been punishment. She said, "I am ready." He reached across the table, over the neat stacks of the dead man's letters, and placed his hand open on the surface between them. She put hers in it. The journal stayed in the library, in the glass case Mr. Alford had suggested, its spine facing out. It was not hidden and not displayed. It sat among the books of the house that had kept it. In the room where the fire was warmest, a small record of what had been witnessed and by whom and what it had cost to say so. On winter mornings, when the frost was on the glass, she could see it from her chair. It had always been hers to deliver. Now it was home,